Hi, my name is Nancy Karst. I'm a licensed independent social worker, and I work at Akron Children's Hospital, and I'm bereavement coordinator within the Haslinger Family Pediatric Palliative Care Center. Well, thank you very much for listening to this module. It means a lot that you have the capacity and the desire to support those persons who are coming to the end of their life. This is not a role for everyone. It's in my training and in my experience that I have felt that I've become more comfortable with grief and bereavement by practicing it and learning from others, in which I hope you'll be able to do the same. You will have many different and many reactions as you do this work. They can be both mentally, they can be emotionally, they can be spiritual. We'll talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk a little bit about some definitions, types of grief, what are some common responses to grief, and what can we do as providers to do the best care that we can offer to these folks. So starting off with definitions, grief. Grief is a person's response to a loss. It can be the loss of a death, but it can be a loss of many things. It can be a loss of a career, it could be a loss of a home, a loss of a relationship. So grief is pretty broad, but we're going to look more today at the grief of the loss after a death. Another term that you'll hear is called mourning, and that's not the morning of good morning, but mourning. And what that means is the outward expression of loss. It's like how we respond in our social world to when somebody has died. The next word that we'll look at a definition is bereavement, and that's a big long word that basically means that you've experienced the death of a loved one. It means that we've been deprived or robbed of a very special relationship that we've had. So we'll take a little further look now at some on the word loss and what that can mean for the work that you're going to be doing. Loss is experienced by the patient or the person that you're serving. They probably are experiencing changes in their body, probably the ability to fulfill roles that they once held, maybe some loss of relationships that they had meaningful in their lifetime. And then they're also looking at the loss of life approaching quickly. For the loved ones that you might be working with, that would mean the family that might be involved or friends involved, or also, I believe, the staff that are working together. You will possibly feel the loss of hope for a future with that person that you might have wanted to have. And also, the loss of the activities that you're doing with that person. I think it's just so powerful, the work that you do in making the most of the moments that you have with this person, that when it ends, it's a loss. So just to kind of keep that in mind. So if we look at grief, there's some major concepts that I think are really important to think about. Grief is a natural human response to any loss. So it's not abnormal, it's not pathological, it is natural and normal. Grief is going to be highly personal, and there's many reasons about it being personal. We're all different individuals, and we've all had different experiences and life experiences. So just realize it's going to be highly personal. There's not one right way to grieve. It's going to be a whole range of ways that people will grieve. And I also like to say that there is no time frame for grief. I think, unfortunately, in our society, a lot of times people want grief to go by quickly, and if it's been more than a few weeks or a few months, people are thinking that it's not normal. That's not the case. Grief is a lifelong experience. It will affect us at different times. It won't be that probably the initial hard pain that you feel at first, but it will evolve over time. Grief is profound, and what I mean by that word is that it affects us on all levels of our being, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. There's many different coping behaviors that you might see in grief, and that these coping behaviors are basically things that help people to ease their pain. So sometimes you might see such things as withdrawal or even passivity, and that's okay. It's almost like we're thinking about it. We're just letting it settle within our souls. Sometimes you'll see people do distracting things or go back to work, and you think, how can you do that? Well, that's, again, it's a nice balance sometimes that you grieve and you get a break from it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about children, how they do that in a really amazing way. But, again, there's lots of different coping behaviors. And one of the ones that gets a bad rap is that people are in denial. And denial is a normal response. And it's okay sometimes to just not realize that that loved one has died, to take a break. So in summary there with grieving takes time and it takes effort. A lot of times I'll hear people say, well, you'll get better with time. And I just kind of cringe because it does take a lot of work at the same time. So just realizing that it's time and effort that you put into it. Grief will not just go away. Our relationships don't go away. So that's why grief won't go away. And one of the things we'll talk about is that you can't really ignore it because it can lead to some destructive things. Types of grief. Two that we're going to talk about here is one is called anticipatory grief. And I think particularly working in hospice, a lot of times what you're dealing with when the individual comes to be a resident at the facility is that you're starting to feel the losses that they're experiencing. They've obviously lost wherever they were before. They're coming to a new place. They're maybe being separated from people they knew before. But we call it anticipatory grief. It might be occurring because it occurs when the death is either approaching or it's expected. And that also it does not necessarily, so you think as you're doing the grief as anticipatory grief that it's going to make grief easier on. Sometimes I think that's a little bit of a misnomer because it's not the same grief as that you'll experience later. So I just wanted to point that out because I think sometimes I think we want to think if I do all this work ahead of time, it's going to be easier later. It probably will be a bit, but it's not going to be the same kind of grief. And the other type of grief, which I think probably will apply a lot to the work that you do here with this hospice, is called disenfranchised grief. And this is a term that was coined by Dr. Ken Doka. And he talked about those parts of our culture and society and so forth that don't always get recognized as being part of the system, and people don't quite recognize all the things they're facing. So, for example, it recognizes those people who maybe are ex-spouses or stepchildren or members of the LGBTQ plus community. Those folks are often marginalized in our society, as well as those who might experience the death through a suicide or overdose or AIDS. Sometimes they're just not considered as part of the general society. So a lot of times their grief can be not recognized. And so that's what disenfranchised grief is. So to kind of go a little bit more into some types of grief that just are kind of, I think, important to point out. The first one is complicated grief. And again, grief is obviously the loss that we're experiencing from the loved one who died, but there's lots going on in people's lives. So there's lots of other things happening. So complications can be the intensity. You didn't realize how close this was going to be to you in terms of feeling the loss. There might be many other layers of issues that are involved, whether it be, concern about how they lived, or they're trying to come up with resources now, or however that might be. So complicated grief is something that kind of has to be unpacked. Sometimes you think about an onion, you just have to kind of go layer by layer, but it takes a lot of work and it takes a little bit longer time than sometimes people think it will take to get through all of that. Another type of grief this might be thought about is chronic grief. And chronic grief just means that it just seems like it lingers and I can't quite get past it, and lots of work will need to take place. But it just has kind of just continued to linger for quite a period of time. One that I'd like to point out next is called delayed grief. And this is one thing that I think as caregivers in a hospice facility you have to kind of think about, because I think sometimes because of the work and there's so much going on that you kind of just push it to the back, like, okay, I'll deal with this later. And then the next thing comes along and you still keep pushing it back. So sometimes with delayed grief, that if you don't do it, kind of in a way that you kind of work it through, it just kind of catches up. And then we get to something called exaggerated grief. And it just kind of accumulates. And so we'll talk about ways to do self-care so that hopefully you'll be able to find expression for the grief when it happens, and you'll be able to keep moving forward. The other part of exaggerated grief that can occur is that you might find that a particular person you work with or a particular, situation will trigger you in a way that you didn't really expect. And that what happens is you'll have more of a reaction. You might even have nightmares or just some fear or things that just you didn't really expect. So sometimes, and again, you might recognize why that happens, but sometimes it just happens and you just need to work it through. Masked grief, again, sometimes when we're grieving, we don't say I'm grieving, but you might look like you're depressed or you might look like you're extra anxious, you can't quite concentrate. So you see these other things that are happening, and that's what we mean by masked grief. It's like those things are covering up the grief that you're probably doing underneath. So I think that's important to remember when you look at your coworkers and you see them kind of not being quite themselves, just to kind of be empathetic that it might be some type of grief that's going on. And the last grief that's pointed out here is just sudden grief. I know even in hospice work, sometimes people think, oh, we have time to work to the end of death, but you don't. Sometimes it will happen really quick. And so sometimes you might just find a death occur really quick, and it's like, whoa, I never even got to catch my breath or get to know this person. And that grief will need a unique kind of expression. Okay, I alluded to before that there are some common responses to grief. And so I want to go through these 6 different dimensions a little bit just to kind of put us all on kind of the same page as to what we might be experiencing. So physical responses to grief. And again, this is just physical, our bodies. So often it's seen through like our daily functions, so eating and sleeping and things like that. So what I've seen in a lot of grieving people, like for instance with eating, some people can eat up the whole kitchen and they're really hungry all the time. Other people don't want to eat at all. So you might see extremes. Same thing with sleeping. Some people can sleep, some people cannot at all. So you've got those physical things to pay attention to. In general, body tension, a lot of times people will express that. You might see bodily changes. So like a lot of times headaches and stomach aches and other ailments. And as I do parent support groups, I always say, please, if those are lingering, I really want you to check out with a doctor to make sure you're okay for sure. But, sometimes it may be, you'll just see some of these things reoccurring as you go through grief. Emotional responses. Again, all feelings are normal and natural. I say that over and over again, particularly when I do kids groups. They think like, well, I'm not supposed to be scared. Well, yeah, you're allowed to be scared. Feelings are fine. So the feelings can range. Obviously in grief, probably the most common ones we talk about are sadness and anger and guilt. Those are very prominent, but they certainly are not the only emotions. So I think just being aware that you can be all over the place. And another one that I always try to say with emotionals is that sometimes when a person dies, and if they have been in a position that for yourself or myself feels like they were suffering, it's okay to feel relief. Sometimes people feel guilty if they have relief, but sometimes that's okay. So I just want to make sure you hear that. The third dimension that I would talk about is the cognitive or the mental part. So again, many of us, you'll read in the literature about people who grieve. Sometimes they're more emotionally expressive of themselves. That's one way to grieve. And another way is to do it more through the cognitive mental side. So for those folks, it's like sometimes they'll say, I just can't concentrate anymore. I can't put 2 sentences together. I forget why I left the room and why I came back. And so again, those don't sound like grief responses, but they are. It's just that their mind is not, kind of working the way it usually does. They also are ones that are prone to like all they can think about all day long is their loved one. And they think that's abnormal. That's very normal to think about that and to probably have it pretty predominant. It also could include just feeling those feelings of disbelief and also that they may start to have some dreams about their loved one. So that's the mental side that you might experience while you're grieving. The next area is behavioral. And behavioral, again, is it can be a whole range of things. Sometimes people have energy and some people have no energy. Sometimes it will be that you feel like you just need your own space and you don't want to be around people. And that's again, very, very normal and part of the process. So again, you just want to kind of watch, and sometimes people might take a path of some unhealthy behavioral things along the way. And again, hopefully within your nice environment at hospice, you guys can keep in touch with each other and kind of just check in. Are you doing okay? And if you start to hear some of those red flags, that's again a good use of your supervision and people here to help make sure people are staying healthy and they're on the right path. The next dimension is social. It affects us socially when we grieve. And I can't tell you, my last 2 years of working with grieving families through this pandemic has been very, very devastating, I think. I think that what we've really seen is that we really do need human-to-human contact, and that has been so disrupted. And particularly in grieving, all of our rituals have been like shortchanged and all of that happening at one time. So we're going to hopefully start to heal from that. But I think that what it pointed out to me, at least, was that it's a dimension of grief we do need to talk about and figure out how can we make sure there's a social support network around those who are grieving as well as the employees that are grieving. And telehealth is wonderful, but it's not the same thing as being in person. So we're going to hopefully be able to rekindle that part of this and make that part of the experience a little bit more full for people. And then the last dimension of responding to grief is obviously on a spiritual or, meaning of this world kind of experience. So some people already have maybe a belief system or a power or higher power or God they believe in. Sometimes that can be helpful. Sometimes it's also difficult to navigate because it doesn't seem right that this is happening. But often, I think in grieving, we have a lot of why questions. Why did this happen? What's next in our world? So those are things that you'll ponder during grief, and hopefully that you'll be able to process and become more full after this experience. So what are some of the factors that affect our grief reactions? And I kind of mentioned before, we're all unique. So since we're unique, we're going to all have different relationships with that loved one who is dying or has died. Sometimes it's been a positive experience, but sometimes it could have been conflicted or a dependent relationship. So you have those things to kind of take into consideration of why you're grieving the way you grieve. I think it's important to talk about, how did the death occur? Sometimes we have some forewarning that it could be happening, and possibly here within hospice, you'll have a little bit of that forewarning that this person is getting close to end of life, but a lot of times you don't. It could be very sudden, it could be unexpected. So you want to think about how the death occurred. For you and also this person who's dying, you want to think about their previous losses. So we talked earlier about all those many dimensions of loss. So you sometimes want to do a little assessment, like what are those previous losses and how is that going to impact their end of life? I think for the person who's grieving, you want to think about their age and their gender and their personality. I certainly know I'm getting closer to the end of my life versus the beginning of the life, and I look differently at things. And someone who's 20 is going to look at this a lot differently than I do, and just how we've been grown up in our culture. So think about that. Spiritual beliefs I just mentioned, social support network, and then other concurrent stressors. So if other things are happening in the griever's life, that's all going to take a part in how they'll respond to this particular grief reaction. So where did we learn about all this grief stuff and how has it evolved? It actually is fairly recent, I'd say, in our history, probably in the mid-1950s and 60s is when it first started getting written about in literature. So it's not that old of a topic. But back in the 1960s, I'm going to highlight two people that did some of the work on grief and grief theories. The first one is a woman by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I think that in our culture, a lot of people have heard that name, and she's been known as, quote, the 5 stages of grief. And I smile at that because she wrote a book called On Death and Dying. And her work actually was as an anthropologist, which is somebody who, looks at like humans and how we evolved. And she did her work in the hospitals, and she talked to people who were dying. That was what her research was about. And what she found were these 5 areas that were very prominent in her work. So I think, the time was ripe in the medical community to have some type of model to grab onto so that you could kind of explain grief and dying and everything. So she actually acknowledged at the end of her life it wasn't a model that you have to follow. These were just things she saw in people, and she wanted people to be aware of it. So I'll go through those in just a minute. And then the other gentleman we'll talk about is William Worden in tasks of grief work. And that has kind of stayed steady through all these years. He, like I say, it was probably in the 60s or 70s he wrote those. And here we are in 2022, and we're still following them. So just to highlight what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross pointed out, and you probably may already know this, but she talked about denial as being one of the things that she noticed in people who were dying, that they had times of lucidity and they just did not talk about death and dying, and that's okay. They didn't have to deal with it every moment of the day. The second part she noticed was anger. A lot of times those folks would express anger, and that it could be anger at their higher power or God. It could be against healthcare providers. It could be against just anybody in the whole world that they just, and sometimes even anger at themselves. So I think that as you are serving folks here in hospice, you're going to probably see maybe some of that come through of folks expressing anger. She also noted that the folks she interviewed talked about bargaining, and bargaining meant that, if I do this, maybe I'll have more lifespan, or maybe if I do this, I won't be feeling so sick. So it's like this bargaining to hopefully feel better or to have a better, grasp of what's going on. The next one that she pointed out was depression. So, anger and depression are kind of like same family. They both come from the root of being fearful. But depression often can look very apathetic, not very engaging. It's a tough one to be in. But I think a lot of times you'll see hopelessness and withdrawal in people when they're feeling depressed. And then the last thing she talked about was acceptance. And that word is a tough one, because that's one that's changed quite a bit over the years. But her acceptance meant that the person kind of realized, okay, I am in this situation. How am I going to make the best of it? And how will I have the most dignity at the end of my life? The reason I say that about acceptance is that that's a elusive kind of term. And, there's always pieces and parts of it, but there's never truly acceptance, I don't think. That's just me. All right, Worden's task model. So what he did in his task model was he talked about, number one, the first task that a griever will go through is to accept the reality of the loss of the loved one. So just the reality has happened and it's in their soul. The next part is experiencing the pain, and that's what we kind of have been talking about, those different dimensions of grief. You're going through processing, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're doing, what your beliefs are. So that's the experiencing of the pain. And then the next third part is to adjust to life without our loved one. So it's that shifting of what you are living through. And then the last part, which is one that is actually very prominent now in the literature, is finding ongoing ways to remember our loved one who has died. And there's new researchers out there talking about continuing bonds and that we always will have connections. So even as caregivers, you may find that there are special things that you will find that you will associate with that person who died, and that you might get little gifts along the way. Like you might come in one day and hear the birds singing, and that reminds you of that person. Or there's a special song that they loved, and out of the blue, you hear that song on the radio. It's like, whatever. Those types of things are what they call continuing bonds. So again, you're not crazy if those things happen, and I hope that you get those, because those usually in the end will feel good. Just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about children and grief. You may find that you'll be working with some children in the program itself, or you may be that just in your own life and your own kids and how they respond to grief. And of course, this is very near to my heart, and I love talking about this. So just the first thing I always want to say is that children and adults will respond to the loss according to their own developmental or maturity level. So again, you might work with some kids who are, seeming a little bit beyond their developmental level, so that's okay. You just want to take that into account. But I also want to think about those adults who maybe in their 20s or 30s, but they really are only developmentally in their teenage years. So just to kind of keep coming back to where are they? It doesn't have to be a certain age that you say, okay, because you're 30, you should think this way. It's always going to be unique because of those two things. So I'm just going to go through just briefly what kind of how it works as we grow from babies up to adulthood. So for kids birth to 9 months, you say, oh, they can't be grieving. I disagree. I think that they, on their own level, are grieving. Then what you see usually is they notice that there's something different in the house. There's either stress involved, or people are not around like they should be. So I mean, they're going to respond to that, and that's what I mean by I think they do respond to grief, and they just need extra comfort during that time. If we look at like about 10 months of age to 2 years of age, they can definitely sense the mood of people around them. And then again, like I said, the whole issue of when caregivers are absent really becomes very prominent for them. A lot of times in the work that I do, one parent can be at the hospital and one parent has to work. I mean, you can see the difference. And you see these kids, they're grieving because they're missing the one parent that can't be there. When kids are 2 to 5 years of age, this is where lots is happening in their life in terms of developmental stages. And that the thing I like to say at this point, even though it's not this age group, but literature tells us through different psychology, and people have researched this, that kids, in terms of knowing the whole dimensions of death and what it means, they cannot even process until they're about 7 or 8 years old, because the brain just has not taken on that capacity yet. So sometimes I always smile because I get many calls at the hospital from parents who maybe have 3 and 4 year olds who keep saying, they have question after question, like, why can't we get the loved one back? And why don't we just go to the hospital and pick them up? Now, come on, bring them home. They're very concrete in their thinking. I'm sure that for parents and caregivers, it's a very trying time, because after the 100th time you've explained it, it's still not going to come through to them. So often at this age, they see death as temporary. If you think back to maybe when you were that age, you watched a lot of cartoons, you heard stories about Cinderella and all these other people. People die and they come back to life. So that's supposed to happen, but it doesn't. We know that, but they can't at that age. So just want to point that out, and that's one of the concepts of reversibility of death that comes later, and I'll explain that. So then now looking at that 6 to 9 year old age group of children, so they are now starting to realize that the death means the person can't function anymore. They're not going to be, eating and drinking and being with them like they were. So they're starting to take that in. And they also begin to feel like maybe they were responsible for the death. And so when I'm asked to talk to families, and I always try to coach the parents and caregivers to say, you always want to kind of say to the children, you did nothing to make this happen. I mean, even though you don't even have them say those words, it's still important for them to hear it. And then they are also starting to think about well, maybe I can die. And we think that you're healthy. And they start to then also worry about their caregivers. Are they going to be okay? So again, you might just want to think that it's part of your conversation, that even though somebody important has died, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to die at this time. Go a little bit older, from 10 to 12 years old. Again, they are now starting to see death as permanent, so it doesn't reverse back and forth like I just described, that it's going to be universal, that every living thing is going to die one day. They are able to take that concept in. And they are now also at an age where they can start to think about rituals as helping in that grief response, which is really, I think, pretty unique, because then they can be a part of that experience with the family or the support system they're involved with. The last age group is kids 13 and older, teenagers. And again, developmentally, if they're at that stage, they're pretty much able to take in all the 4 aspects of understanding death that we've kind of been able to characterize, so that death is universal. It's going to happen to every living thing. That death is irreversible. The person is not going to come back. Non-functionality, that the person who died will no longer do all the things they used to do, and that there is a causality to the death. They can start to understand that certain things will lead to a death, whether an illness or an accident or something like that. I think the important part to remember about teenagers is, number one, we know that it's a very highly emotional time, so they can be all over the map just because they're teenagers. So you add grief onto that, you often have both those things happening. But the other part we've watched with the support groups that we do, that there's a very strong importance of peers. That if you bring them together with peers, they really do seem to find a way to cope in a pretty positive way. So in general, how can we help grieving children? I think we're going to, number one, think about their developmental level as part of what we want to address them at that right level. I always say you want to be honest, you want to be simple. And if that's the only two words you hear me say, that's important, because you don't ever want to lie to a child, because it's very hard to go back and change your lies. They trust you as adults, so you want to be honest. And that, sometimes it's hard to tell the whole honesty of a truth. So for example, if somebody maybe completed suicide, it's very hard to tell a 6-year-old about suicide. I mean, that's going to take a process. It's not a one-time thing. And so a lot of times I will coach and tell parents, start at the beginning, this loved one has died, and what that means that they've died, and that we're going to build this story over time, and that, you ask me your questions and I will do my best to answer them, but, you don't have to go into great detail about exactly all those details. But as you can maybe hear through that story, I'm not lying to them that the person didn't die, and I'm not lying to them about the suicide, but it's just a very delicate concept that you're going to want to build. You just can't just throw it all out there at one time. I think it's important when you talk with children, you want to use the words that their loved one died. You don't want to say they're gone or that they're sleeping, because those terms for kids are very different. A lot of times we've seen, if you tell them, well, my loved one's sleeping. Well, if I sleep, am I going to wake up? That kind of thing. We don't want them to have to ponder difficult questions like that if possible. I think for kids, it's important to keep a schedule and a routine as much as possible. And I kind of smile because I know when you're grieving, it's hard to do that anyways. But I think if we intentionally think about it and try to keep some routine for them, that'll be very beneficial. Telling children what to expect. So, when a loved one dies, if they've not ever been through this before, they don't know what the next steps are. So you're going to probably want to introduce terms like, well, we're going to have a funeral service, or we're going to have a celebration of life, explain what those things mean, because, they've not ever been through it before. And I already mentioned about, making sure that they know that this death was not their fault, and that you want to encourage their expression of feelings. And expressions often aren't in words for kids. A lot of times it is through their play. So hopefully giving them opportunities to play and to kind of observe what they're doing. You'll learn a lot from where they're coming from. Want to encourage activities with their peers, because again, I think that kids will relate to other kids sometimes. They're often afraid to talk to the parents or caregivers because they think if I talk about it, they're going to cry and I'm going to upset them. Well, we all know that we're going to cry. And again, when parents are concerned about that, I say, just explain to your child this, I'm sad and that's why I'm crying. It's not you. You're not making me cry. And so you're just really trying to normalize this very difficult experience. Want to involve children in the process as much as you can. Even young kids I've worked with that, they can draw a picture of their loved one that could go with the casket, or they could, do something special. They'll plant a tree that will be remembrance of their loved one. Whatever they can be involved with, I think helps that processing for them. Again, allowing kids to participate in death rituals. I don't get these calls as much anymore, but I used to get calls like, well, should I take my child to the funeral service? Well, it's not the same for everybody. Again, it's unique. So I think it's a conversation you would have with your child, explaining to them what would happen. And if they want to go, great. If they don't want to, that's okay too. And just making arrangements so that they can have somebody who would be with them during whatever way they choose. We use a lot of art and music and storytelling and all that kind of thing. I think all that's very valuable for children to use to help the grief process. Of course, as parent caregivers of children, when kids are really, really struggling with something, and it certainly is perfectly fine to reach out to other resources and folks that can help process it in a different way. So that's there. So just to shift a little bit in terms of now looking at you as a hospice caregiver, how can we make sure that you are going to be as strong and as healthy as you want to be through this experience? So the big thing I put at first is just taking care of yourself. I think that's a first step. We want to give everything we can, I know, to this experience and helping the individuals and those that are affected by this person's end of life. But at the same time, you also have to take care of yourself because you can't do this on no fumes. understanding your own feelings and reactions around death. You're going to process that. You might think, well, it's not about me, but it is. You do have to know where you're coming from. And I think a lot of the work that you might do is just being with somebody. You don't have to ever have answers. You're just going to sit with them and be present and allow them that space. And that's really okay. There's not anything you can necessarily say or do that's the right thing to do. Again, I think our coworkers and our supervisors and people that we work around are very, very important. Continue to have conversations. Today I was just a part of a thing that's called, quote, a death cafe. And it's just an opportunity for staff to come together and talk about like where you're at, what are you experiencing, no judgment to it, but it's just putting it out there. And it's amazing how, just hearing from your coworkers give you even more strength to keep going on. So that's important. Involving yourself in rituals and support groups. Certainly that's an option, like I just mentioned. A ritual that we did with our team, which I think has been I was surprised. We just have a wreath that's in our office, and every time we have a child that we serve that has died, we put a wreath on that, a ribbon around that wreath, so that we have fellowships at our hospital. So the fellows are with us for 1 year. So it's 1 year of these experiences. And it's just that humble experience of walking in that room and just realizing all those children and families are with us. And, we honor them. We don't, each week we read their names. We don't have to read them every time, but you know what that's meaning in the room. So I hope that within your facility, you guys will be creative and think of what will help you with ritual with each of these wonderful people that you'll be working with. Again, using your vacation time to get away is important, whether it's even just listening to music or gardening or whatever it is that gives you that extra energy. Please try to make sure that you make time for that in your world. I think you will want to watch for, quote, negative coping. I think it often, when things are painful, sometimes we turn to things that aren't so healthy, whether it be alcohol or drug use, or even just total exhaustion. And those are places that none of us really want to be at, and we want to make sure that we can find assistance so that we don't get there. Again, using your support system and your supervisors is a great idea. I've mentioned a few things that you can do, but also I think journaling, exercising, meditation, being as creative as possible. There's all kinds of things that are out there that can help maybe keep you strengthened and motivated. We talked earlier a little bit about cumulative losses, and I do think that in hospice work, that's a very important piece to always pay attention to, because they just keep adding up, and sometimes it's really important to try to address each one as they come. The impact of holidays and special days during our grieving. So I think even within a program, we'll see that at the holidays, that sometimes it feels heightened, that I don't know why grief seems stronger at this time, but that's part of the process. But also in our individual grief, I think we all know that when we're grieving, there's different firsts that you go through, and that then year to year, they still keep coming back. So just to kind of, again, monitor ourselves and monitor our program so that we're addressing that. There's always going to be unexpected triggers. You never know which one might pop up. I am trying to think of many examples, but like a resident might be with you, and then another one comes that just reminds you of that first one again, and like, why does that person remind me of it? Well, maybe this part of their personality or something triggers that way. But just to be aware that there can be triggers. And sometimes people get worried about them, and that, I think that one of the authors that I read a lot, his name is Alan Wolfelt, and he talks about, he calls them memory embraces. So hopefully, again, it can be more of a positive experience, that thank goodness that that's coming to me at this time. It has special meaning. And then we talked about rituals aiding in the grieving process. So one last part is that how to help the grieving adult. And I think that's probably when I do support groups, this is one of the biggest topics we always get, like what people say that helps and what people say that does not help. And so we just point out a couple of them here for you that I think will be hopefully reassuring to you. So good things to say is I'm sorry about your loss. It's very simple, very direct, and people can take it from wherever they want to. You're not putting any judgment. It's also always very nice to say to someone, tell me about your loss. Where are you at? What's happening? And then I think one of the biggest gifts I think is that tell me some stories that you remember about my loved one. I mean, it opens up a conversation. I think sometimes people are hesitant to do that because they think, well, it'll just make you upset. And I think universally I've watched that nobody ever minds talking about their loved one. They loved hearing stories. So all those things are good things. So what are things that we want to make sure we maybe stay away from? I think one of the ones that sounds like it would be a good one is this, I know how you feel. So I know how you feel is okay, but it's like, you really don't know how I feel because we're all different. And so sometimes that minimizes the griever. And they think like, oh, well, never mind. I won't talk to you anymore because like, you already know how I feel. So that one's a tricky one. But, I think sometimes people will say whether this was God's plan for your loved one. Well, that doesn't often help in the beginning. Another one to kind of watch for is you'll get over this. I think that as we do this work, we know that grief will work its way out, but it's not very helpful to say to them, you'll get over this, because there's so much of that work in the middle that we have to do that just seems very hollow to someone who is grieving. I think another one is not trying to make them feel better by saying, you just need to cheer up, you need to do this, or give advice. I think that's one that we often chuckle about in our support groups, that everybody has some advice. They know how to do this better, but we really don't. So again, just I think being a good listener and trying to accept even times of silence, just being present with someone is a great gift to give to a grieving person. Allow for loved ones to be with the body and helping make arrangements if they want to be so involved. I mean, I think that's important. Encouraging expression of feelings, sharing memories. And again, one of the tricky ones too is offering to help. So sometimes you may receive as a griever, give me a call and let me know what I can do for you. Again, that's pretty hollow. I mean, a griever often is very exhausted. They don't know what they want. They don't know what to do. So it's often much more helpful to say, I'm going to be going to the grocery store tomorrow. Can I grab groceries for you? And then bring them to them. Or, just practical things that you think will be helpful to them. That would be something to think about. I think the other thing that's important about for helping grieving folks is that we realize that, as I mentioned, grief is a lifelong process. So often it may be that people in the first weeks or months will get people contacting them or coming by to make sure they have food or just taking care of them. But once you get beyond a couple months, obviously people around you, their worlds continue to go on. They have other things happening in their lives, so that your grief is not necessarily primary on their radar screen. One of the powerful things I think we've learned in our program is our Dr. Freebird, who is our director, thought that we needed to send cards to families when a child's birth date came up or the date they died. We do that. We send a personalized card for 5 years on that day. And I can't tell you the amount of appreciation I get from these families that say, you're the only one that remembers at this point in time, because it's been so far out. And it's not a hard task to do. It's, it's a privilege to do it, because actually, I think as a caregiver, it's actually meaningful to me too, because then I can reflect upon that child and that family again. So it might be something your program would want to consider, but there's many ways to do that. But I just think that one's been very powerful in my experience. And then, even attending a funeral service or expressing your condolences. I often do teaching with doctors and residents at the hospital that sometimes think, well, I better not show up. They don't want to see me. I can tell you almost 99% of the time it's the opposite. They are so impressed that somebody would care enough to come. So don't, think that, you would ever, I think, unless you really know it would make it hard on a family, but for the most part, it's going to be very much appreciated, and that, it's okay to do that. All right. So if we just summarize maybe some of the things I've said today that maybe you'll be able to walk away with. Please remember, grief is a normal and natural response to a loss. It's not abnormal. The normal responses to grief will include those areas that I spoke about: physically, mentally, spiritually, socially. Grief will be unique and personal for each and every one of us. There is no one right or wrong way to grieve. Realize that you will experience your own grief when you're caring for people who are dying, and to take care of yourselves. Grieving will take time and effort. Grief will not just go away. And that really realize that between your staff and also other resources in our community, there are resources for people to cope with grief over the lifetime. Thank you.